for you to hear about City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, a citywide text amendment that will change zoning to allow for equitable housing development. This text amendment will enable the creation of a little more housing in every neighborhood by removing the layers of exclusionary zoning that have created barriers to housing growth. This proposal will update our zoning to better meet the needs of today's New Yorkers. If each neighborhood, from the highest density to the lowest density ones, were to add a little more housing, New York City could add a lot more housing overall without any single neighborhood experiencing dramatic changes or overtaxed infrastructure. Next slide, please. New York City has seen tremendous job growth over the past 20 years, but housing production has not kept pace with the city's growing population. The little housing growth that has happened, particularly new affordable housing, has been concentrated in relatively few neighborhoods. This has led us to a city with a historically low vacancy rate of 1.4%. That lack of housing choice is felt every day by New Yorkers. In a tight housing market, landlords can charge high rents, and existing tenants are vulnerable to tenant harassment, poor housing quality, and displacement pressures. Not having enough homes is also the direct cause of homelessness. Changing our zoning can respond to each of these issues by increasing the number and the types of homes available at a range of incomes in every neighborhood across the city. A little more housing in every neighborhood can have other big picture benefits for New York, including bolstering the local economy and supporting the environment. This complements the other two City of Yes text amendments, City of Yes for Economic Opportunity and City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality. Next slide, please. This text amendment is the biggest pro-housing change that DCP has ever undertaken, and we'll be touching the zoning for every single part of the city so that no one area is taking it on alone. Some of our major proposals include the Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP, which will allow bigger buildings for affordable and supportive housing in every medium and high-density zoning district. Across the city, we're proposing to remove residential parking mandates, which make housing more expensive. We're also enabling more missing middle housing, or low-rise apartment buildings in our low-density areas. We'll do this through town center zoning and commercial corridors and transit-oriented development in highly accessible areas. These proposals are the ones that we'll focus on tonight. We also aim to help homeowners in low-density neighborhoods by creating an accessory dwelling unit, or ADU program, and providing small buildings with additional flexibility to adapt over time. There's also a range of smaller proposals that will enable a few important housing projects that can help bring New Yorkers the housing they need. These proposals include enabling the conversion of non-residential buildings, allowing for small and shared apartments in central locations, and allowing for residential campuses to add height-limited buildings if they so choose. Next slide, please. So tonight, we'll be talking about two proposals applicable in our low-density areas, or the areas with R1 to R5 zoning districts. These low-density neighborhoods, with their wide variety of one-family, two-family, and low-rise apartments, have long been a staple of New York City. However, since 1961, more and more restrictive zoning rules have been layered onto these districts. The end result is that it is often either explicitly illegal or practically infeasible to build anything other than a single-family home. As these complicated zoning rules have been added to the low-density districts, these neighborhoods have almost completely stopped producing new housing. This has exclusionary effects, preventing New Yorkers who don't already own a home in our low-density neighborhoods from living there. The lack of production in low-density areas also puts pressure on the medium and high-density parts of the city to produce more and more housing to meet New Yorkers' urgent demand for housing. But because these rules are relatively recent, with most being added in the 1990s and the early 2000s, the wide array of old buildings in our low-density areas overwhelmingly don't match our narrowly prescriptive zoning. This means that popular and attractive building forms, including low-rise apartments, define our low-density neighborhoods, but would be illegal to build today. Next slide, please. Simple low-rise apartment buildings, like the ones you see on this slide, are sometimes referred to as missing middle housing. They're middle housing both because of their physical scale, neither a single-family home nor a skyscraper, and because they tend to serve middle-income residents. It's relatively affordable to build a building at this scale and therefore more affordable to potential tenants or home buyers. For decades, buildings like these provided important housing options for working New Yorkers in the low-density districts. But increasingly restrictive zoning has banned these buildings, which is why they're called missing. Any of the buildings pictured here would be impossible to build today. Next slide, please. Re-legalizing missing middle housing advances fair housing while also being attentive to the built character of New York City's low-density areas. Modest apartment buildings can address the exclusionary zoning that currently prevents multifamily, low-cost homes in much of the city. Providing more housing choices in the low-density areas can help a range of New Yorkers. This includes young New Yorkers who may have grown up in low-density areas and want to get their first place close to home, or working families who want to settle down in our low-density neighborhoods but currently can't afford to. These buildings are more affordable to build than taller apartment buildings or single-family homes, so their market rate prices end up being more reasonable for middle-class New Yorkers. We also expect that some missing middle housing may take advantage of existing affordability programs or tax incentives, resulting in more income-restricted affordable homes in areas that currently produce close to none. These proposals can also open up new homeownership possibilities. Today, homeownership is out of reach for many New Yorkers, especially New Yorkers who want to live in low-density areas but can't afford to purchase a single-family home. The size of these modest apartment buildings works well for homeownership models, including the city's own affordable homeownership programs. Allowing this kind of modest development also has other benefits, like opening up opportunities for nonprofits or minority and women-owned businesses to build housing. Next slide, please. City of Yes for Housing Opportunity includes two key proposals for re-legalizing middle housing in our low-density areas, which I'll walk through in detail in this presentation. So first, town center zoning will allow for buildings that have ground floor commercial uses and 2 to 4 stories of housing on top. This proposal is only applicable in areas where the zoning map already allows for low-density mixed-use buildings. Second, transit-oriented development will enable 3 to 5 story apartment buildings on large sites that are near transit when they meet specific locational criteria, such as being located on a street over 75 feet wide or on the short end of a block. This will help to add a little bit of housing in every neighborhood while respecting the built form of our low-density neighborhoods. Next slide, please. First, I'll walk through our proposal for town center zoning. This proposal aims to re-legalize mixed-use apartments or buildings that have a ground floor commercial use and a few stories of housing on top. This type of building is very common in our low-density areas and is in fact already permitted in over 5 square miles of the city. This proposal simply removes the complicated and restrictive zoning rules that currently make a building with a single story of commercial and 2 to 4 stories of housing on top practically infeasible. This housing type will mirror the buildings that are already present in many of New York City's most successful commercial corridors. This type of construction is also relatively affordable and can take place on underused commercial strips currently occupied only by single-story commercial storefronts. This means that this proposal could realistically deliver urgently needed homes that are affordable to residents. Next slide, please. So town center zoning is applicable in our low-density R1 to R5 districts where commercial overlays are already mapped. You can see these areas in blue on this map. These are the parts of the city where the zoning already allows a mixed-use apartment, and no new uses will be allowed as part of this proposal. Floor area and height limits will allow for buildings that have 3 to 5 total stories, including the commercial ground floor. The height and floor area limits will depend on the regulations of the underlying zoning districts. Sites that are in the greater transit-oriented development area, meaning they're half a mile from a subway or rail station, will be allowed to build a 5-story building, including a commercial ground floor. This promotes walkable town centers right near transit, a sustainable model of development that will help both residents and local retail to thrive. Our proposal to lift residential parking mandates will also complement these changes and make this type of mixed-use building feasible. Commercial parking waivers will also be available for small lots with good proximity to transit. Next slide, please. The proposal for town center zoning is based on New York City's most successful low-density commercial corridors, which exist throughout the 4 outer boroughs. Here, you can see a mixed-use building along Northern Boulevard in Jackson Heights, Queens. These neighborhood shops, with a few floors of housing on top, provide important housing options walkable to the neighborhood resources and transit, while also promoting a vibrant local economy. But this 1931 building could not be built today because of our low floor area and height limits, as well as our high parking requirements. Right across the street from this building are a series of underused commercial storefronts. It's nominally already allowed for those buildings to redevelop as a mixed-use apartment, but it's practically impossible for them to do so. Town center zoning simply wants to make this type of existing development possible once more. Next slide, please. In the next section of this presentation, I'll walk through our second proposal for missing middle housing, transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development will allow for low-rise buildings on sites that are near transit and meet specific criteria. These criteria include having a lot size over 5,000 square feet and a location on the short end of the block or a wide street, which zoning defines as over 75 feet in width. These modest apartment buildings can offer more housing options in the low-density areas that are attainable for working New Yorkers. Today's restrictive and exclusionary zoning often only allows for one of the least affordable housing types there is, a single-family home. Our transit-oriented rules can promote a type of housing that's affordable to build and therefore more naturally affordable to future residents, while mirroring existing development. This proposal also promotes sustainable development by adding housing in areas that have good transit access, helping New York City to reduce our carbon emissions. Next slide, please. Low-rise apartment buildings, like the ones enabled by our transit-oriented development proposal, are already very common in the low-density neighborhoods that have good access to transit. Before our current restrictive zoning was put into place, it was very common to build a small apartment building on a corner and then have 1 or 2 family homes lining in the mid-block. It's an organic style of development that just makes sense. It provides a range of housing options for New Yorkers' different needs. But since the 1960s, we've layered on zoning rule after zoning rule that make this type of building illegal. We just want to peel back that restrictive and exclusionary zoning to allow for this kind of common sense development. Low-rise apartment buildings that mirror these existing precedents. Next slide, please. Our transit-oriented development proposal takes a tailored approach, allowing these modest apartment buildings only in select locations. To qualify for the transit-oriented development regulations, sites must meet a few different criteria. So first, they must be located within half a mile of a subway or rail station. This geography will be called the Greater Transit-Oriented Development Area and is shown on this map in the gray outline. In purple, you see the low-density zoning districts that fall into that Greater Transit-Oriented Development Area. If a site is in that area, it must also be over 5,000 square feet and located on either the short end of the block or on a wide street. If a site meets all of those criteria, it will then have as-of-right access to transit-oriented development regulations in the zoning. These rules will afford the site enough additional height and FAR to build a modest apartment building. This height and FAR scales with the rules of the underlying zoning district, helping these buildings to fit in with their surrounding context. Anything above the 3rd floor will also be required to be set back from the street. Next slide, please. So here we see an example of a low-rise apartment building developed under the proposed transit-oriented development rules. This block is a 2-family district, meaning today only 1 or 2 family homes could be built. But under this current proposal, the site would qualify for transit-oriented development rules because it is 1, over 5,000 square feet, 2, within the Greater Transit-Oriented Development Area, meaning it's half a mile from a subway or rail station, and 3, it's located on a wide street or on the short end of the block. This allows for a 4-story apartment building with 18 apartments, providing urgently needed housing opportunities in a residential neighborhood that has great access to transit. Next slide, please. The changes I've walked through tonight are just some of the initiatives proposed as part of City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. Overall, this text amendment aims to create a little more housing everywhere so that each neighborhood does its part to address our housing needs, and a few neighborhoods don't feel the intense pressure that they do today. It's not just about adding more housing, though, it's also about more types of housing. Multifamily housing, where it's currently not allowed because of exclusionary zoning, units of different sizes to meet different people's needs, and crucially, far more affordable and supportive housing. Next slide, please. So thanks so much for joining us here for our 3rd of these monthly info sessions. We look forward to your questions and comments tonight and hope you might return for our upcoming info session in April, which will provide an overview of the entire proposal. You can find more information about these info sessions as well as other ways to stay informed on our website, which is nyc.gov/yeshousingopportunity. Now turn it over to Elizabeth to moderate the questions.
Thanks so much, Veronica. So as we move into the Q&A portion, I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people on the call tonight, and quite a few questions have already been submitted over email and through the Q&A. So we are going to be alternating between answering questions from attendees with hands raised, again, using that raise hand feature, and from the Q&A feature. To ask your question out loud, please raise your hand. When you're called upon, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. To use the Q&A feature, again, just simply type your question and we'll answer them out loud. In order to get to as many questions as possible, we do ask that you be brief and ask a single question at a time. Then after you finish asking your question, you'll be muted. Again, we really want to prioritize hearing from as many people as possible. Please feel free to add additional questions through the Q&A or re-raise your hand. And just to be fair, we will let everyone ask a question before returning to anyone for additional questions. So getting started, we've got some questions about transit-oriented development. And I'm going to try to bundle a few of these together for you, Veronica. So first, could you please explain the criteria used to establish your transit-oriented development boundaries? Can the boundaries change, or might new zones be created moving forward? Then what exactly is the benefit or bonus for the developer of a property located in a transit-oriented development zone in comparison with properties not located in a transit-oriented development zone? And then, yeah, let's just start there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for those questions. So the Greater Transit-Oriented Development Area is an extension of the existing transit zone, which is the part of our city that has the best access to transit. We'll be renaming the Inner Transit-Oriented Development Area, and then extending that geography to include the Outer Transit-Oriented Development Area, which captures additional portions of the city that are best served by public transportation. We define this as a 0.5-mile radius around subway or rail stations. If a new subway or rail station is added, low-density districts 0.5 miles around that station would then also qualify for transit-oriented development. The second question was about the exact sort of differential, the benefit someone might experience by being in the transit-oriented development area versus not. So just to recap the proposal quickly, if a site is located in the Greater Transit-Oriented Development Area and meets those criteria I outlined, over 5,000 square feet, the location on the wide street or the short end of the block, it would be able to add an apartment building as of right, and that's whether it's in a one-family, two-family, or low-density multifamily district. The height and FAR limits will vary based on the underlying zoning district, as does what is originally allowed. If you're interested in more knowing the specific differential for a particular zoning district, you can check out the tables in the draft scope of work, which include those numbers. But generally, TOD will have an FAR of 1.0 to 2.0, whereas the basic low-density districts have an FAR of 0.75 to 1.5. Low-density districts generally already allow for buildings with a 35 to 40-foot maximum height, which is similar to how tall TOD buildings will be able to add, though some will be able to add additional stories above that, or one additional story for a 5-story building.
Fantastic. And how will this designation impact supportive and subsidized housing projects?
Yeah, so this proposal, I spoke on the presentation that it will allow for naturally affordable housing, but we also do think that some buildings will be able to take advantage of affordability programs to allow to support income restricted affordable units. This would include a future tax benefit at the state level or existing HPD programs, including programs for affordable rental or affordable homeownership. Some of HPD's affordable homeownership programs actually work best with small buildings. They're difficult to work at the current scales of buildings that are allowed. So we think these will fit really nicely with the transit-oriented development rules.
Great. Let's shift over and hear from a couple folks with their hands raised. Frank Morano, you're first.
Frank, you should be seeing a message on your screen asking to accept promotion panelist. If you click on it, you'll be moved into a place where you can turn on your microphone and camera. Okay, Frank, let me try just giving you the ability to turn your microphone on here. Frank, you
Okay.
should, there you go. We can hear you, Frank. Oh. Frankie, just turn your click your microphone on.
All right, ready?
Yes.
You showed a development going along the Staten Island Rapid Transit. The only thing it's used for is get people to the ferry and kids get to high school. When people have to operate on Staten Island, especially in the South Shore, it's all by automobile. The rapid transit, the transit is not there for it. People go to the store, it's by car. People do anything, it goes by car. The model on Staten Island is going to be to the supermarket. The supermarkets have the lowest prices, and that's where people are going to go. They're not going to go to the corner store to do their general shopping because it's going to be a lot more expensive. So the model that you're presenting without parking, I think, is unsustainable. Everybody is going to have a car. The people living in the apartments above the stores are going to own cars. You have to provide for the parking. That's my statement.
Thanks for your comments. We expect that in areas of the city that we recognize are auto-oriented, we understand that some parts of, especially Staten Island, other low-density boroughs are, a car is a part of many people's daily activities. We anticipate that in new buildings in those areas, developers will continue to provide parking in parts of the city that are low-density parts of the city or other parts of the city that are far from transit today. Developers are often providing parking above what the requirement dictates today. And so we think there's reason to believe those developers will continue to provide parking so that people, in order to be able to rent or sell those units.
I have to disagree with you. A developer once told me that if you have enough parking, you do not have enough building. Okay, the developers are looking to maximize their profits, which means to make the structure as big as possible and the parking as little as possible. Without regulations requiring parking, they will not put it. That's been our experience with Community Board 3. We always have to fight for the parking.
Hi, Frank. Thanks for the question. By the way, I'm John Mangan from our housing division. A couple more responses to your questions, I would say, is that New York is not the first city to propose lifting parking mandates for new housing. In fact, we're kind of behind the curve on that. There have been other cities in New York State, like Buffalo or around the country, that have removed the parking mandates. And what we see is, as Veronica described, in areas that are more auto-oriented, in order to move those units, if you're a developer, in order to get people to rent them or buy them or whatever, and if they have cars, you need to provide parking. And so we fully expect in parts of Staten Island or other lower density parts of the city that developers will continue to provide it. And Veronica wasn't just conjecturing about that. We have examples of buildings today that are in process, applications before the City Planning Commission that even know that we're proposing to lift parking mandates in the near future, who nonetheless are locking in more parking spaces than required today for the housing that they're building. It's fairly common in parts of Eastern Queens, parts of South Brooklyn. And so we think that's another good indicator that removing parking mandates doesn't mean that no one's going to provide parking. It just means that we'll be reducing conflicts between parking and housing in, more central parts of the city where they really are in conflict today, and we see less housing than would make sense in those areas.
Thanks so much for the question. David Pecoraro. David, you should be able to unmute yourself.
David, you should be able to unmute yourself. I think David may be experiencing some technical difficulty. We'll note it and we can come back.
Sounds good. So just switching over, just a quick question on process. Veronica, when will the draft text of the housing opportunity proposal be available? And has an environmental impact statement been written for this project? And if so, what are the specific findings?
Great process questions. So draft text for the housing opportunity will be released in the coming weeks, well in advance of entering the public review process, so that people have time to read all those pages, really dig in. And we have undertaken a full EIS, environmental impact statement, for this project. That will also be released in the coming weeks, and that will include unit projections for the various elements of the proposal, including the missing middle housing proposals.
That's great. All right, let's move back and hear from a few more folks with their hands raised. Robert Press, you're next.
Okay, I am in favor of your transit center zone, your town center zoning and transit zoning, which is 3 to 5 stories. However, we have new Metro North stations coming into Bronx Community Board 11, and we already have a proposals on paper for an 18-story building of 2,083 units, a 17-story building of 424 units, and a 12-story building in a flood-prone zone of 398 units. How come we're getting higher buildings than what you're talking about right now? And we also have at another station, Morris Park, in our community board, a building of what's known as unknown height. Why is that?
Thanks, Robert. Those are really great questions that I think get at something really important about the difference between the housing opportunity proposals, which are citywide, and some of the proposals you mentioned in the Bronx, which are a neighborhood study. Now, when you do a neighborhood study like the one you mentioned in the Bronx, that tends to be a site-by-site look at everything within a fairly limited geography, involving all the stakeholders over typically a period of time that you measure in years, in order to look at proposals that can sometimes change the nature of a neighborhood, can change the character of a neighborhood. One recent neighborhood study, for instance, was Gowanus. Gowanus was an underutilized, manufacturing area, which through a decade-long neighborhood planning process has turned into an area that is going to see a lot of new housing, for instance. I would contrast that with the complementary approach represented by City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. Instead of a significant amount of housing in a limited geography, housing opportunity represents a little bit of housing across the broadest possible geography. And the idea there is that if we do a little bit more housing in every neighborhood across the city, that we can create a significant amount of new housing overall without changing the neighborhood character in any particular place, or without overtaxing infrastructure, because we know that certain parts of New York City have infrastructure issues. And I think Missing Middle really illustrates for me some of the benefits of that approach, where we are really looking to New York City's past, to types of buildings, like a few stories of residential above retail, that people know, that people tend to like, that is all over New York City, but from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. We have a housing shortage now, a very severe housing shortage, and those buildings are illegal. We're taking a look to our past to try to bring that back as part of a broader citywide effort to enable a little more housing everywhere in a way that respects the existing context of the city's neighborhoods. And so what you mentioned is a neighborhood planning effort that is in process right now, and that will also be subject to full environmental and public review. But it is a different and a complementary process to the one we're talking about tonight.
Great. I'm going to try to go back to David Pecoraro. I think I saw you come back off screen, so maybe your technical issues are resolved.
David is rejoining as a panelist.
David, you'll need to accept the invitation to join as a panelist.
It may just be taking a moment for the transfer. Hold on 1 second. David, you should be able to turn your microphone on now. Okay.
We're
Okay,
going to
David.
keep trying.
Yeah,
We're-
let's move on.
Sounds
There
good.
we go.
So Veronica, this is coming to you. Will this trigger mandatory inclusionary housing?
We are not proposing to require affordability in the middle housing types that I discussed tonight, allowed through so either the transit-oriented development or town center proposal. Requiring affordability makes developments at this scale economically infeasible. It just can't pencil out the same way that MIH, mandatory inclusionary housing, can work in a high-density building. Administering a mandatory affordability program at this scale of building would also be very difficult for HPD, and that would create a barrier to getting people into urgently needed housing. But although affordability will not be required, we do think that these units, buildings may be more affordable naturally, or will be more affordable naturally than other housing typologies. They may take advantage of existing tax incentives or public subsidies, like I previously discussed.
Great. Thank you so much. And David, I think you finally made it.
Yeah, it's a glitch in your system, not in mine.
Sorry about
But
that.
that's okay. The problem I have is with the subway accessibility being lumped in with the Long Island Railroad accessibility. In Southeast Queens, we don't have true subway accessibility. We just have very long bus rides on very crowded buses to the subway, or very limited Long Island Railroad capacity and scheduling. That's it for the Queens Long Island Railroad stops in my community of Rosedale. I sit on Community Board 13. I'm not speaking for them, but as an individual member. The problem with your half-mile radius is that's too large. If you want to do it 1 or 2 blocks in radius around the stations, that makes some sense. But we physically cannot take the buildings that you're suggesting because the buildings will sink into the land. Rosedale is made up of former swampland. Those buildings physically cannot exist for a very long time. They will become part of the subterranean level. So you've really got to rethink your radius. Otherwise, it's not acceptable. If you want to do a 1 or 2 block radius around, 3 blocks maybe, fine. A half-mile radius would mean that most of Rosedale would cease to look like it has, because developers would simply buy up the housing, the individual housing, and spit out 3-story buildings, and you would destroy the community. You would have what people who moved to this community 20, 30 years ago moved from. They made the choice to join a community like Rosedale, like Laurelton, like Cambria Heights. Okay? And you're changing the community beyond what it has a capacity. We depend upon our cars. Your parking rules cannot work here. Cannot. If you start building these 3-story monstrosities. We just don't have that infrastructure. Our schools do not have that infrastructure. Our streets do not have that infrastructure. Our sewers, which are just getting built in some areas, don't have that infrastructure. There's simply everything is based upon the 1 and 2 family model that this area has had. And trying to make it fit the size 10 foot fit into a size 8 shoe is never going to work.
Thanks,
so I
Dave.
guess that.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. I'll try to address some of the concerns that you mentioned in turn. So yes, you're correct that the proposed transit-oriented development area consists of a half-mile radius around mass transit stations. And I would say that, back to the answer I made to the previous question, when we were looking at how to enable a little more housing in lower density neighborhoods, we really took a look at the types of buildings that are in those neighborhoods today. And remember, back to Veronica's presentation, it's not enough to be in that transit-oriented development area. You also have to be on a large lot, larger than most of the single family or 2-family homes that you're talking about in Rosedale. You got to be a large lot, and then you have to be on a wide street. So you wouldn't qualify if you're on the streets of typical width in Rosedale either, or the short end of a block. And so that kind of narrows it down. You got to meet all those criteria. And when we took a look at what already exists in New York City, lots of those criteria very often have modest apartment buildings on them already today. 3, 4, 5, even 6 stories on those sites. We're not even proposing 6, but a lot of those have that like uniform 6-story semi-fireproof apartment building that was built everywhere in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s in New York City. So, I understand what you're saying about those concerns, but we're really talking about types of buildings that already exist in these areas, and they extend even beyond that half mile from transit. They really are everywhere in our lower density districts. And so we think it's, as we try to figure out ways to add a little more housing in neighborhoods like this, that it's very supportable from a planning perspective to enable 3 or 4 or 5-story buildings on sites that meet all those criteria. And you're correct. When you're making changes of this sort, you have to do a full range of environmental review. Just to flesh out what Veronica mentioned a little bit a moment ago. Our environmental review is looking citywide. It's the biggest environmental review we've ever done across the full range of impact categories. I think there are like 27 different impact categories that involve everything from storm and sewer, to open space, to school seat capacity. And we will be able to identify those parts of the city that are right on the edge or even over for things like school seat capacity or things like stormwater infrastructure, and make sure that we, as a city, are addressing those issues in conjunction with enabling more housing there. I know a lot of people think that city planning can make decisions in the absence of collaboration with our fellow agencies. That's definitely not true. We are working with every conceivable relevant city agency on this proposal, DEP particularly closely, the folks who handle stormwater capacity analysis. And I can tell you just in the last couple of weeks, instances where things that DCP wanted to do, DEP said, we're sorry. We lack the stormwater capacity in this area, and we accept that expert advice. And so we don't think that we are doing, anything that unduly overburdens or overtaxes infrastructure with these proposals. And we will be making that full environmental review public in the weeks ahead.
Great. So moving back to the Q&A, John, I'm gonna keep you on here. Are there any tax benefits or abatements in constructing near transit-oriented development areas?
So, tax abatements are handled at the state level rather than the local level. And there are no current tax benefits that I'm aware of at the state level specifically for developments within the transit-oriented areas. That said, we are hopeful that there will be a renewed tax incentive for mixed income multifamily housing. The old one was called 421A. We believe that any renewed version is going to include requirements for affordable housing at truly affordable levels. Not that 130% area median income option that was part of previous iterations. So we're excited about that. And what we've seen historically is that apartment buildings of 6 or more units tend to use that tax benefit, tend to require that tax benefit in order to pencil out. So if we enable in zoning modest multifamily buildings, we're talking 6 units, 8 units, 10 units, 12 units in that area. We expect that folks would use the tax incentive, the renewed tax incentive, and include formally, legally income restricted units in those apartment buildings, in addition to the relatively inexpensive units that Veronica mentioned that you can produce with a missing middle model that's less expensive to construct than a single family home or a high rise.
Great. And so, Veronica, this one's coming to you. Why not include development along major bus routes? Could transit-oriented development areas be defined to include neighborhoods with proximity to select bus service stations in addition to rail stations?
It's a great question about how we developed the greater transit-oriented development area and why we've decided on this 0.5-mile radius along subway or rail stations as the geographical criteria for eligibility. So ultimately, that makes the proposal and the policy easy to understand, easy to administer. You know if you qualify or not, if you're 0.5 miles from a subway or rail station. It is also easy to update over time. If we add new subway or rail stations, 0.5 miles from those would also be able to qualify. We did, think about other sort of methodologies, including bus routes and other measures of access to transit, because there obviously are some areas that have, great bus access, but maybe they don't have a rail station. And those just, ultimately became very confusing. It became, maybe not the best and simplest way to approach this issue, which is a huge part of this proposal, is simplifying our zoning to make it easier to understand and easier to build housing. That being said, this is just one proposal among many transit-oriented development, and so many of those locations may be served by our other proposals. So for example, many select bus services in the low-density areas travel along commercial corridors. Those might be able to take advantage of the town center zoning that I walked through tonight, or other proposals.
Great. So Veronica, kind of thinking about low density, can you talk a little bit about the economics regarding a development, small development, one that has only 18 apartments? Is that cost effective for developers?
Yeah, so building a low-rise apartment building is a much more affordable construction method than building a higher density building. So we think that it is affordable for developers to pursue. The zoning makes it quite difficult, but there are, in some cases, 18-unit buildings being built in certain zoning districts or maybe on a large lot. There's no reason to think that that is not a size that could work for apartment buildings. And as John mentioned, a building of that size could potentially take advantage of, a future tax incentive or something like that. But again, we think this style of construction is appealing to build. It's, affordable and therefore more affordable to tenants or homeowners.
Great. All right, we're going to switch back over to the hands. Dolores Orr, you're next.
Dolores is being promoted.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dolores Orr. I'm Chair of Community Board 14 in Queens. And we're a very unique community We were devastated by Hurricane Sandy. We are currently in Zone 1 flood zone. And it is such a high level of flood zone that the new New York State Home First Down Payment Grant Program, we have been excluded from. We cannot borrow money to buy a house in Rockaway. There is no evacuation plan. The current building of new buildings does not allow any resident to occupy the ground floor. And therefore, you should not allow anyone to occupy a basement in a Zone 1 where you can't even build a house that has a basement. In addition to that, we currently have about 30,000 housing units in the pipeline coming into our small community of 7 miles long and 4 blocks wide. And all of the buildings that have gone up already, in all the buildings, there's only one commercial space rented. Everything else is empty. And that's what's going to happen throughout the state, the city, because we know that retail has changed since COVID. So we will not support this at all. Our lives are at stake here, and Community Board 14 in Queens needs to be excluded from this plan 100%. It's been more than 10 years since Sandy, and Office of Emergency Management has yet, 10 years later, they have not come up with an evacuation plan. We cannot live with this. People will die if you allow this to happen in this flood zone 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores. You raised some really important issues in Queens Community District 14. I want to say, first of all, that the subject of a previous citywide zoning for coastal flood resiliency, we implemented a set of regulations that, for instance, basically discourage, prohibit residential development in special coastal risk districts. This would not change that at all. That create allowances to ensure that existing or new development can be made more resilient to flooding, whether tidal or whether periodic weather events. This is intended to work with those regulations and doesn't do anything about those. Within the 100-year floodplain, for instance, we would not be enabling any residential uses in a basement or anything like that. So as we roll out these housing opportunity proposals, we are extremely conscious of those areas of the city where new housing or new types of certain types of housing just don't make sense. And that's a baseline health and safety issue. And I can't overemphasize how seriously we take that with these proposals. Next, I also want to acknowledge that Queens Community District 14 has seen a ton of development in recent years. And we think that our housing opportunity proposals, which, as Veronica said, they're intended to enable equitable development across the city as a whole. As it is today, 9 community districts produce as much housing as the other 50 community districts. And that is, in many instances, a function of zoning, where certain neighborhoods are really good at preventing anything from happening, preventing new development from happening. And it pushes development, because we're bursting at the seams with housing demand. It pushes development to parts of the city where it's still allowed. And I would say that under the status quo, the system as it exists today, I would say that Queens Community District 14 has seen a disproportionate share of development. And so when we forward these proposals to enable a little more housing everywhere, we fully expect it to take pressure off of neighborhoods like yours that have seen a ton of development in recent years. Developers, if given their druthers, would probably develop housing, in more central locations with closer access to jobs and transit than Community District 14. Well, zoning often prevents them from doing that. And you end up with a situation where, like you said, you have an enormous pipeline of units in Queens Community District 14. So I completely understand your concerns. And, even co-sign some of those concerns. But I would say that those are reasons why you should support the housing opportunity proposals, not the reasons why you should oppose them.
Great. Angus Fisher, you're next.
Yes. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, so I had a question. I'm from East New York, Brooklyn. And what we have been told, I'm also on Community Board 5. A great portion of our community is per se in a flood zone, within the 1 mile flood zone of Jamaica Bay. So I was curious to find out how does not allowing basement parking in certain places where residential living cannot happen, shift or take away from some of the units that can be provided for um, people to live in, because it's inhabitable for people to live in a flood zone in a basement. Why can't it you can't have that variance if they build sturdy enough to have parking in the community? And yes, I know East New York it has a rich transit going throughout the community in certain areas, but in other parts there's no transit. There's actually a lack of transit. And we want to know how is something like this going to actually benefit our community, when you're taking away so much parking in our community. It's like developers are afraid to build in our community because we're asking for parking, and it's only fair that they develop some level of parking in our community if they're looking to come and eliminate the parking off of the street. If you want the community to meet you somewhere, you got to meet them somewhere. Give them some parking in the buildings or in the basements of the building or something of that nature, and then you can have more of the street parking in certain sense for some of those commercial corridors at least.
Yeah, thanks for this question. So under this proposal, parking will still be allowed at the level that it is, today or higher. The owner will be able to determine the appropriate level of parking as well as the location of the parking. So if there's a site where subgrade or at-grade parking makes sense, they would still be able to add that. And that might be in, a flood prone community in which, providing parking at grade and then residential space above makes sense. The developers will still be able to do that. We're actually making several changes to the zoning that make it easier to locate your parking, so that there will still be opportunities for people to add parking, including at grade. And they will not be able to, add residential spaces in new capacities or ADUs in that subgrade space.
Yeah, I just want to underscore that, well, we're proposing to lift parking mandates for new housing citywide, but this is not an anti-car effort. It's a pro-housing effort. Like Veronica mentioned, we're making parking easier to provide in many instances by providing floor area exemptions for it, on sites that can fit it, by relaxing location requirements, by enabling people to share parking that's already provided in the neighborhood by existing developments. And so we're trying to ensure that parking is a flexibly allocated shared neighborhood resource, just also that it doesn't get in the way of housing provisions in places where that's what the desperate need is.
So, John, there was actually a question specifically for you, kind of along those parking lines. Can you talk a little bit about the data from some of the cities you cited earlier, that supports some of the expectation you were telling us about, that developers will continue to provide parking despite the elimination of parking mandates?
Gotcha. The studies that I'm familiar with have looked at Buffalo, Austin, a number of jurisdictions in California, and they support that baseline understanding that there's an assumption that if you remove parking mandates, that developers will just provide no parking whatsoever because, it does take up space. It does cost money to provide. But, developers are business people as well. And in instances where parking is an important amenity in order to market your unit, whether it's a rental or home ownership, developers will provide that. And, developments cater to different types of, of residents. If a development is being created that really does cater to that auto owning resident, then like I said, in places like South Brooklyn or Eastern Queens, we've seen developers providing more parking than necessary under the existing regulations. And we see that in Manhattan too. I mean, today under the Manhattan core regulations, there are no parking requirements today there, and there haven't been for a number of decades. However, we still see developers coming in and applying for discretionary actions in order to provide development there. It depends on, the types of clientele those developments are looking for, and, the degree of auto dependency in that part of the city. And that's supported by those studies in other jurisdictions. Maybe we can put some in the chat.
That'd be great. And Veronica, how will some of these parking regulations affect buildings that are currently under construction? Will they still be required to meet the old parking requirements?
Buildings have to comply with zoning at the time that they're permitted. So existing buildings, including ones that will be constructed by the time that this is passed and are currently under construction, would have to comply with the parking requirements that when they were permitted, and they won't be able to remove existing parking. No existing parking will be able to be removed unless they pursue a discretionary action to remove that parking. So again, we're not looking to take parking away from anyone. We're just looking to open up some new housing opportunities in new buildings going forward.
Thank you. Back over to the hands. Olive Freud, you're up.
Olive, you should be able to turn on your microphone and camera.
How's that now? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this city of yes, and we're talking about housing. To me, housing means if it's 200 units or 6 units, you may have differentiated, but housing to me is the total. And I'm interested in density. After you've got done all of these calculations and you want to put more housing into the city, how much more housing do you think we can go into New York City? How much are you planning for? Do you think there's a limit on how much New York City should have?
Thanks, Olive. Great question. We understand, and I think we've spoken before. Good to see you again. It's a fairly common sentiment that we hear when we go out in communities is enough. What are you just going to keep building housing forever? What's the point? Why not just say that we've got 3.7 million housing units and that's it? We don't need any more. And as planners, as folks who care about the future of the city, that's just a really scary idea. Because what happens if we were just to somehow put a cap on the number of housing units in this city at a time when, the economy is continuing to grow, is that you'd put more and more and more pressure on the existing housing stock. People would be competing more and more for the housing that exists. And, who loses out in a situation like that? It tends to be the folks who are lower down on the income chain. And so you would take what's already a very difficult, soul crushing, endeavor in the city, trying to find housing, especially at a time when, it's 1.4 rental vacancy rate. That's the lowest since 1968. And you would just make it that much worse. You would create a city that was no longer a place of opportunity for new immigrants or for people lower down the income chain who are coming to the city for educational or professional opportunities, and you'd really just turn it into something that only wealthy people would be able to afford, a place that only wealthy people could live. And I don't think we need to get into the details on why a scenario like that, it just strikes me as totally dystopian. This is a place of immense opportunity, and it has been for generations for people from around the country and around the world. If we want to preserve that on a fundamental level, and if we want to make the city livable for people who aren't rich, then building housing is an absolute priority, and finding out ways to make that possible is a huge priority. And that's why we're trying to do a little bit across the widest possible geography, so that we can create a ton of new housing while being really respectful of people who might be skeptical of neighborhood change.
Thank you. Maybe try to pull off from there a little bit and think about some of these missing middle housing types. Will this increase in FAR for low density in these low density districts? How is the bulk going to be regulated? Will quality housing regulations be expanded to apply, or height factor? Will site exposure plates still remain?
Yeah, this is a great question about how we're determining the building envelope, or sort of like the space the building can occupy on the lot for a missing middle housing. For those that don't know, quality housing is a set of regulations that includes height limits in the high density districts, whereas height factor is a more complicated and outdated set of zoning regulations where you sort of calculate how high and how much you can build based on a variety of factors. But in these districts, in the transit-oriented development proposals, the town center proposals, these will receive new building envelopes that include height limits and an FAR limit. So in the transit-oriented development area, there's FAR limits are between 1.0 and 2.0, and height limits are 3 to 5 stories. The above, with anything above the third story, required to be set back, and a flat roof will be allowed. So it has that building envelope in the zoning. Again, you can review that in the draft scope of work. But both of these proposals do include height limits and FAR allowances that are like flat FARs, not height factor calculations, for those that are familiar with those.
Great, thank you. Nancy Walby, you want to come off mic?
Nancy, you should be seeing a little message on your screen asking you to accept promotion to panelist. If you just click on that, you'll be moved into the panelist. It might take a second, but you'll be able to turn on your mic and your camera. Okay, Nancy, you got it. There you go.
Yes, I'm sorry, another screen popped up and I couldn't see that. I think I wrote my question in the box, and it was answered about the EIS. That my understanding is there is not an environmental impact statement currently available, but it should be soon. Am I correct?
Yep, that's correct.
All right, I have, that answers my question. I have so many other statements, but I'm not in favor of yes. But you answered my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks, Nancy. So Veronica, can you describe what some of homeowners' options are on their property?
Yeah, so I think this is a question that's really tailored to some of our other proposals that we've walked through in previous info sessions about accessory dwelling units, and then we'll walk through next month about both accessory dwelling units and some of the fixes we're making to low density districts to relieve some homeowner issues. So today in our low density districts, many owners of single family homes or small buildings have buildings that are out of compliance, meaning they're not in line with today's zoning rules. So if they go to make an alteration to their home, they often face obstacles. That's even if they're not looking to add an additional unit. So by providing slight height increases, FAR bumps, and decreasing the yard requirements in our low density districts, we'll make it easier for homeowners to make some of those alterations. This may also include in two-family districts, creating a two-family home. And we're also proposing an accessory dwelling unit or ADU program. I encourage people to watch our info session from last month that really dives into this more deeply. But that proposal will allow any one or two family building to add one accessory dwelling unit, size limited at 800 square feet if they so choose, which will allow for help homeowners, maybe help with their household expenses, help multi-generational families have a little more space, and also provide important housing options in our low density districts. So direct you to the website for more information on those, and also please come back next month to hear more.
Great. And how can nonprofits collaborate and partner in this?
Yeah, so I mentioned this very briefly in the presentation, but we think that by opening up opportunities in the low density areas for this kind of affordable construction of low density apartment building, that'll open up opportunities for nonprofit developers or other small businesses to add housing. Right now, in today's highly competitive and constrained land market, only the most well-capitalized companies are able to, purchase land and develop housing. But by opening up new opportunities across the entire city, there'll be affordable opportunities for people to enter the land market and thus build housing. So we think that'll work well for nonprofits. That'll work well for new kinds of affordable development, like community land trusts or other kinds of models. So we think that'll be a really key place to partner with nonprofits across the city.
Great. So thinking about size requirements, with the density factor, will minimum size requirements for dwelling units be adjusted to accommodate the additional FAR or floor area ratio? And if so, will it be more standardized in the way it is for higher density districts?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I'll provide a little background about how the dwelling unit factor or density factor works for people who might be unfamiliar with it. The dwelling unit factor is a measure in the zoning that dictates a minimum average unit size. So it doesn't actually establish a minimum size for any one unit. It establishes that you would have to achieve that size across the entire building. So you would have to mix large units with small units, for example. As part of one of our other proposals for City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, we're proposing to eliminate the dwelling unit factor in the transit zone, which again is the part of our city that has the best access to transit. We think this could enable, in the high density districts, many of those are high density districts, that would enable smaller shared apartments that would allow people to live alone who are currently often teaming up with roommates and occupying family-sized units. It also just creates a more rational framework, especially in the low density districts. Our dwelling unit factors vary wildly district to district. In the high density districts, they're currently all 680, but in the low density districts, they can range arbitrarily. And so by establishing 500 outside of the transit zone, that creates a more rational framework that will allow for units of various sizes to meet market demand. The absolute minimum average unit size for any given apartment will continue to be regulated by the building code and housing maintenance code and other rules.
Great. And then just one more from the chat for you, Veronica, before we go back to hands. We've heard a few times in this presentation that missing middle housing will be naturally a bit more affordable without mandating affordability. So can you just talk a little bit about kind of how that might work and how we at DCP think about that?
Yeah, sure. So as I've mentioned, for a huge driving factor of housing costs when you're building a new building is how expensive construction and land are in New York City. Because these types of housing, the land and construction costs will be minimized. The land will be less expensive because we'll have opened up more opportunities for housing. The construction is a more affordable method than a high density building. Those savings in the development of the building will be passed on to potential tenants or home buyers who are then looking to purchase or rent those homes. This is supported by other cities that have developed missing middle housing and have seen more like middle income opportunities in those buildings, as well as our own history. As I've mentioned in the presentation, these housing types, a low density apartment building was really like the home base for many working New Yorkers, before 1961. But we've made that housing type illegal, and we can just look to the past, I think, to sort of see a model of how this might play out, introducing natural affordability to the low density areas.
Yeah, I mean, even just picking up Veronica's point, even in more recent history, you go back to the early 2000s, and we saw 6-unit, 8-unit buildings, sometimes referred to as Fedders buildings, new construction, that were going for $200 and some $1,000. Now, I know some people have said things like, well, they're not the prettiest buildings in the world, but a new construction home ownership unit for $200 and some $1,000, I don't know what that is in 2024 dollars exactly, but it's a lot cheaper than basically anything we're seeing today. And we made that illegal. And so if we can bring something like that back, 6 units, 8 units that are within reach for a much broader range of New Yorkers, I would consider that to be a huge victory.
Thank you. All right, let's go back to the hands. Pedro Rodriguez.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you. So I kind of just wanted to start by saying that definitely like what you guys are doing with the City of Yes. I am a public member in Community Board 6 in Queens, and I'm also a new father. I'm 35. I've been here since I was 12. And one thing that definitely worries me a lot is that in 20 years, my kid is going to be 20 something, and he's going to be looking around and deciding where he wants to move. And I feel I would definitely love for him to be able to say, hey, Dad, I found an apartment down the street, or I found an apartment in Elmhurst, we're living for sales, or in Jamaica, or somewhere else, quick subway trip over here just to come for the weekend or so, or whatever, or I go over there, or maybe a bike ride. And not for him to say, hey, I'm moving to New Jersey, I'm moving to Connecticut, I'm moving to Florida, I'm moving to Arizona, I'm moving to Texas. Which is what's happening, because I mean that is what I'm hearing a lot here, by the way. Like, how many family members do we know that left the state, and now we never see them? So I'm gonna go ahead and say it. I know you guys are not saying it, but I'm gonna say it. I don't care about character of the neighborhoods, or I bought this 20 years ago and I want it to look the same. I want my son, who is gonna turn 1 next month, to be able to have an apartment and afford it in 20 plus years. That is what I care about. And I want him to also, have a healthy environment, and this is also going to help with that. Now, the thing that I am worried about this proposal, and there's a couple of things, but overall I support it. But I am worried about other things beyond zoning that may actually prevent the more building of housing. Because I do agree, if you lower the cost of housing, then you increase the profitability, and now a lot of things that didn't pencil out are now penciling out. Boom, more housing. We see it everywhere. Tokyo and Minneapolis right now, Austin right now, is working. So, but parking mandates is one of those things. But then what about things like impact fees? I don't think that's mentioned in the city of Yes, or things like single staircase requirements for a certain amount of buildings. I know that's technically a fire code, but is this something that the city of Yes can help with, or what other non-zoning regulations are you guys looking into to make it easier to build more housing?
Thanks a lot, Pedro. That was really powerful stuff, and it echoes things that we've heard elsewhere in the city as well about, if we want to preserve our neighborhoods for the people who live there, they have to be able to flex a little bit. They have to be able to grow a little bit in order to accommodate, the people who live there, their kids. Was on a church visit out in Jamaica a couple weeks ago, and I was talking to a pastor of a church out there who said that his congregation was dwindling, and I said, "Oh, like because of COVID and people just didn't come back?" And he said, "No, it's just like they're disappearing because of housing costs. Like the kids of his congregants, they just can't live in the neighborhood anymore. And like you said, they've all moved, down south or out west or whatever." And that, what you said and what he said just really drove home for me is that if we care about neighborhood character, if we care about preserving neighborhoods for the people who live there, then they have to be able to flex and grow a little bit. And I think that's the nature of these proposals. Yes, we are having conversations with a full range of both city agencies and also just external stakeholders around the types of issues that you talked about. Impact fees, unfortunately, are pretty tightly regulated in New York State. It's one of the strictest states in the country. I'm a former lawyer, or I still am a lawyer, but I, don't practice in my current role. But it's one of the strictest states legally when it comes to things like impact fees. So it's one of the things that we would have to look to the state too. Next, building code type stuff like single stair, or layout in terms of apartment flexibility. We've become conscious over this process of the ways that zoning gets in the way of those types of things, and are doing, it's kind of like deeply buried in housing opportunity, are changes to the way that we regulate, especially medium and high density buildings that create like long double loaded corridors that prevent, apartments from having layouts with like multiple frontages or cross ventilation or things like that. Ways that our trash room regulations are both like too restrictive and like not restrictive enough in a way that like adds costs, and diminishes quality of like the apartment buildings that people live. And so we are looking at those things. We are working with DOB. We're working with sanitation on these things as well. And we're having conversations with, think tanks that work on these types of issues in order to do what we can in these zoning amendments to address those issues, and also working with like DOB and other agencies that have jurisdiction over other relevant pieces. So thank you very much for your comments. Feel free to get in touch with us if you have more ideas about, changes outside the zoning that we should be thinking about.
Great, thank you. So we do have quite a few questions in the chat about the Bronx Metro North proposal, and I want to try to kind of bundle them together because it's not really what we're here to talk about, but I want to make sure that we get you some answers. So, can you talk a little bit about how this is working hand in hand with the Bronx Metro North proposals? Talk a little bit about why there's a difference between what we're seeing proposed in that neighborhood plan versus what we're talking about tonight, and just any of the other reasons that there might be kind of differences between the City of Yes proposal and what folks are deliberating around with Bronx Metro North.
Thanks. Those are great questions. And, we're city planning. We are the planning agency. And I see, neighborhood plans and citywide actions as very complementary, both very necessary types of planning. that, both involve extensive outreach with the full range of stakeholders. The stakeholders may be different in those instances. When you're talking about a neighborhood study, you're talking about a smaller geography, and you really want to make sure that you're talking to anybody who has any interest in that little patch of New York City to discuss a set of proposals that, like I mentioned, often can result in significant change in particular neighborhoods. And that's, a necessary type of planning effort. It's not every neighborhood that needs to change or that's ripe for change or would make sense to change. But over time, sometimes it makes sense to do that type of deep, focused look at a particular part of New York City. And that's what Bronx Metro North is, in conjunction with this plan to significantly increase transit access in those areas, taking another look about what is this neighborhood, what should it be, what could it be? Again, with the full range of stakeholders. If we waited to, if in order to change zoning, you had to do everything neighborhood by neighborhood, then it would take us 270 years, to go through that process with all the neighborhoods in New York City. And unfortunately, all these factors, regional, statewide, national, even global, wouldn't wait for us in order to, conduct that neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood planning effort. And so it really makes a lot of sense as well, on occasion, to take that broadest look at the city as a whole and, think about particular issues in a comprehensive way. And so that's what we see housing opportunity as being, is a comprehensive look at the city, at its housing needs, and to devise a range of proposals that work in different types of neighborhoods to create a little more housing everywhere. And because it's so broad geographically, because we're taking such a wide look at the city, it's not going to result in as big a change in any one place. There are no planning efforts that I can think of that are dramatic changes across a super wide geography. That's just not something that would really make sense from a planning perspective. But incremental adjustments across a wide geography, that's important on occasion. More significant changes in particular neighborhoods, that's also important. So it's not either or. These are very complementary efforts. And, that's kind of how I think of Bronx Metro North, or, AIM Up in Crown Heights right now, neighborhood studies, versus the housing opportunity text amendments.
Thank you. Let's go back to our raised hands. Laura Spalter, can you come off mic?
Okay. Hi, can you hear me? I'm sorry. Okay. Ms. Brown, you had spoken about the role of buses in TODs, but it wasn't clear to me whether there is any role of buses in the outer boroughs in the TODs for your making of purposes of the map. I thought I had seen that in the scope. Could you clarify?
Yeah, sure. So that, if you've been reviewing the draft scope of work, we previously proposed a different geography for the transit-oriented development area, which included areas with good bus access. We have since, based on feedback from the community about the difficulty to understand that geography and the difficulty to administer that geography as part of a zoning proposal, we have shifted to the current proposal, which is 0.5 miles from subway or a fixed rail station, so Long Island Railroad, Staten Island Road, et cetera. It no longer includes the bus station. So the draft scope of work map is no longer up to date. The map in these slides is what is the current proposal. Sorry, I think you muted yourself, Laura. Oh, she's gone.
Right. I want to make sure, was that her full question? I worry we may have cut her off a little too soon. So Laura, please feel free to re-raise your hand if you had I think there was kind of more to that. But while we do that, maybe could we talk a little bit about how this proposal is going to work in tandem with the current regulations for lower density growth management areas in the zoning resolution?
Great question. Lower density growth management areas cover large parts of Staten Island and parts of Eastern Bronx. And they tend to have, higher parking requirements, larger lot sizes, and a range of other things that can make it more difficult to produce housing there. So we went regulation by regulation to see what types of regulations it made sense to adjust in lower density growth management areas and what regulations it made sense to maintain. And while City of Yes for Housing Opportunity will have consequences for LDGMA, most significantly is we propose to include them within the elimination of parking mandates for new housing moving forward. Lower density growth management areas will continue to exist and be relevant for other types of regulations as well. Again, especially in lower density growth management areas, those tend to be, pretty darn low density, like 1 or 2 family homes. Outside of our missing middle proposals, they will remain 1 and 2 family districts. We fully expect that when you build a 2 family home or a 1 family home in lower density growth management area, you're going to provide parking for that house. So, we don't expect our parking proposals to have that big of a consequence for lower density growth management areas. That said, they are included in the citywide proposal as well.
Great. So our next question is coming from Staten Island, and referencing some of the recent special districts like the Special St. George District and the Special Bay Street Corridor and the Special Stapleton Waterfront District. Will the housing opportunity proposals eliminate the development impediments that exist in these districts, such as no parking waivers for new subdivisions, which are very concentrated along the train line and allow more workforce housing and affordable housing developments for our teachers, police, and fire department employees?
Those are great questions. And it's similar to the way that we're treating lower density growth management areas. We've taken a look, gone special district by special district to see in which instances it makes sense to carry through housing opportunity proposals all the way through, unchanged in special districts, and in which cases some of those proposals have to give way to essential planning goals that are embedded in those special districts. As a starting point, we really support and we love the housing opportunity proposals. We think the approach to do a little more everywhere makes a ton of sense, and we don't want to exempt special districts from that. In some special districts, the changes will be carried through wholesale. In other instances, and that's the case with parking for the most part. I'm not aware of any special districts where we will be proposing to retain parking requirements for new housing, for instance. When it comes to changes to allowable floor area within given zoning districts, typically special district will carry those housing opportunity changes through to special districts. In instances, however, where there's like a really special floor area limit in a given district, we would not propose to change it dramatically in order to equalize it with citywide. We would tend to just adjust it in a way that reflects the housing opportunity proposals without, eliminating the special status of the regulations that apply to those sites. So I guess my answer is it's textured and it's based on analysis of, what makes individual special districts special. We started from a baseline of wanting to carry through our housing opportunity proposals, but there are many instances where adjustments were made to reflect those essential planning goals embedded in special districts. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to the hands, Cheryl Martin.
Can you hear me? Oh.
Yes, we
We
can
can
hear
hear
you.
Oh, okay, great. I'm a resident. I'm not part of any board or anything like that. I just wanted to be clear when you talk about this new housing thing. Are you talking about existing housing? Because I mean, I see a lot of empty buildings, or are you talking about constructing new buildings on empty lots, or tearing down empty buildings and putting up new ones? I'm not quite clear on what's going to be done.
Yeah, so this is a citywide zoning text amendment. And what zoning allows, or what zoning is it's a set of rules for what can be built. So a new building or an alteration to a current building. And so these are proposals that would affect what could be built under the as of right zoning. So could be built without seeking additional actions in a new building and alteration to an existing building, what you'd get permitted by the Department of Buildings. As for existing buildings, and including ones that may be not currently rented, and what we're doing for those, we think that's actually very limited. There's is a 1.4% vacancy rate, as we've mentioned a couple of times in the city right now, and that's at all levels of the rental market. So there's an extremely low vacancy rate for rent stabilized units and other affordable units such as those. There are new buildings that sometimes do face obstacles to leasing up. So there are obviously improvements that can be made to administration, but there are very few vacant apartments at the moment, and those are sort of not facing zoning obstacles, but perhaps other obstacles in administration. This will just dictate what could be built under the current rules. That answers your question.
So I'm sorry. So just so I understand, so the zoning rules then are just rules and regulations for any new buildings or for any existing buildings to be renovated or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah,
That's
John, do
right.
you want to?
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, primarily the changes that we're talking about would enable construction of new housing in new buildings. That said, we recognize there are types of vacant and underutilized buildings around the city. Maybe office buildings in central locations where now that everybody's working from home, or maybe former convents or monasteries in lower density districts that might be converted to housing. And so we're making changes to our adaptive reuse regulations as well, to enable creation of new housing in existing non-residential buildings. And that's not one of the biggest aspects of housing opportunity, but it is an important one that I think gets at your question. So a little bit of everything is what we're trying to do.
I'm thinking about the 7 or 8 empty buildings that I pass on the way home. I live in the Bronx. When I'm coming up from Manhattan, and I pass like 7 or 8 empty buildings. So I'm just wondering, and they've been empty for a couple of years. So I was just wondering where those would fit into your plan. I mean, is that something to do with the owner of the building, if the owner is still around? I mean, have you looked into the number of empty buildings in the city, being that there is such a shortage?
I'm curious about what buildings you're talking about. We have our email address, housing opportunity, at planning.nyc.gov. Cheryl, if you want to send us the addresses of those buildings, I'd be curious to look at them myself. I'm not sure if you mean residential or non-residential. Like Veronica says, there can be other issues beyond the zoning that prevent buildings from being occupied and used. So send those along. I'd love to take a look.
Great, thank you. So Veronica, over to you. Is DCP going to create a racial equity report for City of Yes for housing opportunity?
Yes, this text amendment will include our racial equity report. which is a requirement by recent local legislation that requires certain land use actions to include a report about the effects on racial equity. So this will include a racial equity report the same way that other citywide zoning text amendments like City of Yes for Economic Opportunity and City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality did.
Yeah, and the meat, the crux of a racial equity report is a consistency assessment with where we live, which is the city's fair housing report, conducted by HPD with other agencies and stakeholders all across the city back in 2020. And, a lot of the proposals that are in housing opportunity grew out of that fair housing report. So I'm imagining that we'll have a lot to say about the consistencies of our housing opportunity proposals in relation to where we live, that fair housing report. If you haven't looked at it, it's a really amazing document. I'll stop right there. We should put that in the chat, but I would definitely encourage everybody to look at it.
Great. Going back to the point that Cheryl raised about vacant apartments, there's a statement in the chat, and Veronica, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about this. The person in the chat was saying that the 1.4% vacancy rate does not include the tens of thousands of apartments that are taken off market and not available to rent. Can you get into that for us?
Yeah, so New York City currently has a historically low vacancy rate, and that's for all types of rental housing, including rent-stabilized units. So HPD published its initial findings for the 2023 housing vacancy survey and found that the net rental vacancy rate for New York City was 1.4%. But for rent-stabilized units, the 2023 housing vacancy survey reported a vacancy rate of less than 1%. So reports otherwise are inaccurate. HPD has looked into, though, how many rent-stabilized units are off the market due to poor housing conditions as a result of owners perhaps being unable to afford to rehab them and put them back on the market. And they've found that that applies to only a very small number of units. While any potential home that could be brought back into the market is obviously critical, it's important to support those homes. There's simply not a lot of vacant rental units when you look at it by any type. So that's both market rate or rent regulated.
Yeah, and every unit is important. Like getting every unit occupied is totally important. Even if we did that, it would only solve a very small part of our housing shortage, but it's a crucial part of the overall effort.
Thank you. Sandy Sakata, do you want to come off mic and join the conversation?
Sandy, you should be able to turn your mic and camera on if you like.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I just want to mention something about the City of Yes. It seems to me that the City of Yes is predominantly to the developers. If we want to really focus on equitable and stop building for the rich, I live near Community Board 9, and in Mount Hope, they build a number of high-rise buildings, beautiful waterfront, and they're not affordable. And it's a community that makes less than $60,000 a year. So my question is, if the City of Yes is really focusing on equitable and focusing on us Black and Brown communities, why isn't there no proposal, as there were many years ago, where they would provide us incentives to buy and become home ownership? I don't see any of that in the description of the City of Yes. And a little earlier when Pedro was talking, that he would want his son to be able to afford, because so many people are leaving the city because it's truly unaffordable with the amount of housing that is available and that is empty, because 138th Street is empty. I prefer my children and my grandchildren to own. And that seems to be phasing out of the City of Yes. and it's been very much focused on bringing new developments, and the people that are getting rich are the developers. What happened to us? You know, the ability to own and have something in your plan that offers that. One example that they did when the brownstones were pretty much demolished and they were just standing there, they provided incentives to us Black and brown communities to own those brownstones, provided us incentives of money to remodel them and build them and keep them for about 25 years and build in our community. So my question is, why isn't the city of Yes proposing home ownership and giving us Black and brown communities the ability to own, instead of giving all this to developers for them to be rich and not live in our communities?
That's a great question, Sandy. I've worked at city planning going on about 10 years now. And I would say when I started, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on affordable homeownership, at city planning, at sister agencies that deal with affordable housing. It wasn't there. I can definitely say that especially within the last few years, the interest in supporting, building, generating affordable homeownership is greater than I've ever seen it. HPD, Housing Preservation and Development, they're the folks who operate programs like Open Door that creates affordable homeownership. And I can tell you that we have spent a lot of time working with them on these proposals to ensure that city planning and that the zoning is doing what it can to support affordable homeownership across the range of densities. Now, we can't mandate ownership versus rental. That's not a land use consideration, but we can make sure that our zoning works with HPD programs. Veronica mentioned, for instance, the topic of tonight's presentation, the missing middle housing, 6, 8, 12, 14, 20 units. That's a size that it's hard to work with affordable rentals, which tend to be 100% affordable rentals tend to be at least 50 units, sometimes 100 or even more. But it's a size that works really well with affordable homeownership. And so we are working with HPD to try to make those connections. Next, in our medium and high density proposals, we're not talking about universal affordability preference today, but we are making sure that that program works with affordable homeownership as well. We're making adjustments to the MIH regulations to make sure that they don't conflict with regulations for the open door term sheets that HPD has, which unfortunately they do today. So we're making adjustments to make that work. And then lastly, we're working in conjunction with council members who have really taken leadership on this issue. The speaker of city council has been a big advocate, proponent of affordable home ownership, along with some other council members in her neighborhood, like council member Brooks Powers and council member Natasha Williams. And so, city council, the administration, the agencies are all aligned to create what I think is going to be a really wonderful new era of affordable home ownership, and the zoning is one piece of that.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions as we wind down our evening. Can we talk for a moment about basement apartments? That wasn't part of the conversation tonight, but certainly something that we're thinking about in City of Yes. Are we thinking that the person in the question asks if we're thinking about legalizing basement apartments and raises some concerns about potential flooding? So can you talk about basement apartments and how they fit into City of Yes?
Sure. So as part of City of Yes, we're proposing an accessory dwelling unit program, which I've mentioned, and this ADU program would allow for a range of accessory dwelling units, and that includes basement apartments. There are, before I get into our proposals for new basement apartments, we recognize that existing illegal basement apartments do exist, and those face many obstacles to legalizing beyond zoning. So those would require other forms of state and local actions to legalize, if that's what your question was referring to when you asked about legalizing basement apartments. But in terms of allowing for a new basement apartment, We've convened an interagency working group that works with HPD, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, the Department of Buildings, other relevant agencies to really look into these questions of how can we safely allow ADUs, including basement apartments. The current prohibition regime has obviously resulted in completely unregulated apartments, and that's obviously unsafe, as tragedies like Hurricane Ida often demonstrate. So we are proposing to not allow basement ADUs in the coastal flood zone, and we're looking very carefully at what regulations or additional rules need to be in place to allow them in more inland areas that might be susceptible to stormwater flooding. So those might include additional flood protection measures in the building for basement apartments, and may include geographies in which they're not allowed. That's something we're currently looking into. Obviously, safety is imperative, but we need to bring these units out of the shadows.
Yeah, and I can say that the administration right now is advocating very strongly for state legislation that would enable legalization of existing, some existing basement units. It's a crucial health and safety issue to, bring these into the formal, legal existence. And so this admin is fully behind that, and I hope that we can succeed this year.
Great. Robert Press, you're welcome to come back off mic and ask another question.
Okay, I was very annoyed with the answer that I got, that the Metro North plan is a neighborhood planning process. How can city planning on one arm say one thing, and then on the other arm, or I should say from one side of their mouth, say one thing, and then from the other side of their mouth, say another thing? That we're only going to put up to 5-story buildings by transit zones, and then say we're going to put 18-story buildings by your Metro North stations in the East Bronx. It appears that maybe that we're being targeted, because last night we had a 49th Precinct Council meeting, which covers the 2 Metro North stations. And when I pressed the captain for an answer on how many officers we have in the precinct, we were told there were only 74 officers on duty in the precinct. It appears that we're being targeted in the East Bronx, especially Community Board 11, by city planning and the mayor of New York to depress the neighborhoods, which Van Nest has already been depressed. So developers bought up these houses in Van Nest by the station, and they're going to build these massive apartment buildings over there. And the community does not like it. The community board is meeting tomorrow night to send city planning a proposal. We have a City Yes Committee, which we will mention. We will give city planning a proposal also on what we think the City of Yes program. I personally think that what I heard tonight was very good. However, it's not being done in practicality in Community Board 11. And I'm also a reporter, and I plan to speak to the mayor on this personally, as I have in the past with Mayor de Blasio. Okay, so I'm just letting you know that right now, that we are not happy with this in the East Bronx, especially in Community Board 11, many of us. We want to have the housing, we want to help you, but we don't want massive projects in our community board. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I hear you. The proposals that we're presenting tonight are part of the citywide housing opportunity proposals. That doesn't mean that there aren't, neighborhood specific or site specific actions elsewhere in the city that change the zoning districts that apply there. These proposals make adjustments to the zoning text in order to enable a little more housing everywhere. When you do a rezoning, when you change the zoning designation on the map, then sometimes that can result in more dramatic changes. And, there are places around the city where those proposals are in process right now. Those are separate processes with separate, public review, land use and public review. So I assume that you are participating in and involved in the Bronx Metro North land use review as well. But that's, where you would need to go in order to make yourself known on that specific proposal.
Thanks, John. Sylvia Kothia? Sylvia, you're welcome to come off screen.
Oh, hello. Oh my God. I think I got kicked out by mistake. Oh my God, by error. Okay.
Yep, you're
I
here.
hear you now.
I'm back on. Yes, good evening. Thank you so very much. Yeah, I just have two quick Q&As. I did post it about the nonprofit as far as collaboration and partnership. So I think that one of the colleagues did mention, did state about that ongoing. As far as that's specific for the nonprofit, I just wanted as far as targeting women in housing, for developers, nonprofit developers, for women in housing, single moms, migrant women, that sort of thing. So I just kind of want to know, where does that align with the, organization's mission and purpose, specifically targeting single mothers and women and elderly women?
Thanks, Sylvia. That's a great question. Here's how I think about opportunities for nonprofit developers, immigrant developers, mom and pop developers under these proposals. As it is today, under the status quo, there are limited numbers of sites where housing can pencil out, where you can, get a piece of land and do something with it. And competition for those sites is really fierce. And who tends to win those competitions? It's the big guys. It's the developers with a lot of money who have been around the block a few times. And we're seeing those types of developers, the big guys, pushing farther and farther out into the city, as wealthier areas get totally built out under the existing zoning. And so you see, areas of central Brooklyn that 20 years ago or 30 years ago, these developers would never go anywhere near. They're buying up sites for, tens of millions of dollars in order to be the ones who build the housing there. And that means that developers who maybe in the past have worked in those neighborhoods, like, nonprofit developers or mom and pops or certain immigrant developers, things like that, can't really compete with the big guys in that situation. So one of the benefits of changes that are citywide that create opportunities everywhere is that, we want to create opportunities again in the most central, wealthiest parts of the city where, zoning prevents it today. And then the big guys are going to go chasing after those. The big guys are going to tend to want to go to the highest market places, parts of the city where, the most money to be made. And based on what we've seen in other jurisdictions that have done something similar, a little more everywhere, we expect that will free up opportunities in other parts of the city for the nonprofits that can't compete today, for the new developers just getting started, for the MWBE developers that the city tries to support in other ways as well. So just in the same way that a lot of new housing creates opportunities for people looking for housing, making these zoning changes also create opportunities for people who are looking for land too, to build a little more housing. And I think that the missing middle proposals in particular, the ones we're talking about tonight, that's where the opportunity is the biggest. I think it's going to be, beneath the notice of the big guys to do 6 units, 8 units or whatever, but it can be a really meaningful addition to the neighborhood for, mom and pop developers, for the nonprofits, folks like that. And so we're really excited to be supporting that sector of the industry.
I also just wanted to add, I think Sylvia's question may have also addressed nonprofits that help women and single mothers and find housing. So many areas of the city, especially low density areas, are basically locked out of providing affordable and supportive housing options, including affordable and supportive housing options that might serve women and children. So we think that these opportunities these zoning changes will open up opportunities for maybe those nonprofits to open affordable housing developments in the areas. We recognize that the housing crunch we're in right now has particular effects on women, especially single mothers, may suffer from higher eviction rates or be locked in unsafe situations because of their lack of housing choices. And so this text amendment is really aimed at, unlocking those housing opportunities for those some of our most vulnerable groups. So, thanks.
Great. So we've got two hands, Jamel Martin and Thomas McGuire. Want to hear from both of you, and then want to let everyone go. This has been a really incredible and robust conversation. So Jamel, please join us.
One moment, we may have lost Jamel. 1 second.
Hi, I'm here. I actually don't have a question. I apologize. I think my hand was up by accident. But it's good to see you, John, and
Yeah,
thanks for
good to see you, Jamel.
all right.
Thomas McGuire, you're up.
Thomas, I'm just going to give you the ability to turn on your mic. Thomas, you should be able to turn your mic on. Thomas may have stepped away or he's experiencing some technical difficulty.
Okay. Well, since our last two speakers were not able to speak and we had a couple of late additions, Allison Martinez, do you want to join us?
Allison, I'll allow you to turn your mic. You should be able to turn your, Allison is in. Allison, there you go.
Yes. Hello. I actually just wanted to ask, I may have missed this, but will this, regarding ADUs, will it be permissible to build on top of the garage rather than destroying the garage? And then what is Department of Finance saying about how the property tax treatment may change if people opt to add these additional units on their properties?
Yeah, great question. So for accessory dwelling units, we're proposing a height limit of 2 stories or 25 feet. This will allow for an over the garage typology. We understand in many of the low density districts, it's important to provide that parking preserve your garage while also providing that housing opportunity. So we believe that this 2-story allowance is sufficiently flexible to make that happen. As for the tax effects, we'll still look into that with the Department of Finance, but ultimately the effects on the effects on property taxes will be up to individual owners to consider when they make their decision whether or not to add an ADU. They'll have to consider, a variety of factors, including the costs for adding the ADU and the, potential revenue they might generate off that ADU, and make that decision for themselves based on whether it pencils out for them and their family.
Great. And so Roxanne Delgado, I'm going to give you the last question, and then we'll do one from the chat and wrap up for the evening.
Roxanne, you should be seeing a message on your screen to accept the promotion to panelist, but I can also give you the ability just to turn on your mic here. I'll do that now. Roxanne, you should be able to turn your mic on using the icon at the bottom of the screen. Just give it 1 second. Roxanne, if you want to email us your question, I think you might be having some technical difficulty. We can drop the email in the chat.
Great. So just to round out the evening, are there programs or policies that are part of City of Yes to allow access or preference to local neighborhood residents to access new housing projects and limit displacement?
Yeah, great question. So the community preference policy is still in place for HPD affordable housing projects. And this is a preference that helps address community concerns that existing residents won't benefit from new development. Where we live, which is the city's comprehensive fair housing plan, though, made clear that both the choice to move and the choice to stay are fair housing priorities. Our current tight housing market robs New Yorkers of that choice. Today's current restrictive zoning also means that some neighborhoods are experiencing intense pressure, including displacement pressure. And that's because other neighborhoods, often those with the best access to resources, have made it difficult or impossible to add new housing. If we enable incremental housing growth citywide, as we've proposed here, we'll create more housing opportunities in each neighborhood. That'll help to reduce displacement pressure, and it'll give people the option to stay in their current place or to move into new housing in whatever neighborhood they would like.
Thank you, Veronica. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this conversation, for staying through until the end, and for all of the really great questions that you submitted. There's going to be another opportunity to participate in a public information session about City of Yes for housing opportunity on April 17th. And again, that one will cover the entire proposal. We would love for you to come back. In the meantime, if you have questions, please email us at housingopportunity@planning.nyc.gov or visit our website at nyc.gov/cityofyes. We are so grateful for this robust conversation and really look forward to continuing it with all of you. Good night.